Imagine a room with a single entrance. Above the door is a digital camera continuously recording every movement. On the footage, you clearly see a man walk inside. 2 hours later, the establishment closes. The crowd exits. The camera captures the face of every single person. But this man is not among them. He did not remain inside, and he never walked past the lens to the outside world. Make yourself comfortable. Today, we lay the architectural blueprints on this table and analyze a spatial paradox that broke the laws of physics. This is not a story about the paranormal. This is a story about the blind spots of reality where the human mind gets lost. Brian Shaffer, 27 years old, a medical student. Height, 6 feet, 2 inches. Weight, approximately 170 pounds. We established these precise physical parameters at the very beginning of our investigation, because in the context of this specific spatial puzzle, they are critical facts. An object of these dimensions cannot be easily hidden within a dense crowd, and it is absolutely impossible to carry it out of a building unnoticed without drawing the immediate attention of security, surveillance cameras, or hundreds of random witnesses. The timeline of this anomaly begins on the night of March 31st, leading into April 1st, 2006, Columbus, Ohio. To comprehend the absolute impossibility of what occurred that night, we must first analyze the physical space in detail. The location is a brand new, recently constructed entertainment complex called the South Campus Gateway. This was not some old, decaying neighborhood with a labyrinth of dark, unknown alleys. The gateway was designed to the most modern architectural security standards. It was brightly illuminated by powerful halogen floodlights, and, most importantly, it was integrated into an extremely dense, multi-level network of closed-circuit television cameras. Any human movement in this complex left a continuous digital footprint, recorded from multiple angles simultaneously. To vanish here meant deceiving the entire digital and spatial infrastructure of the building. That night, Brian and 2 of his companions were visiting a bar called the Tuna Saloona. This specific establishment had a unique architectural layout, a layout that, despite its apparent simplicity, turned it into a perfect, inescapable spatial trap. The Tuna Saloona was located exclusively on the 2nd floor of the Gateway complex. It had no facade doors opening directly onto the street. To access the main entrance, patrons had to enter the building on the ground level, approach a designated escalator, and ride it up to the 2nd floor. This escalator ended at a relatively small landing area. Immediately beyond this landing stood the massive main doors of the bar. In the strict terminology of architectural security, this design is known as a choke point, a narrow bottleneck. It is a spatial barrier through which absolutely every single customer is forced to pass, with no exceptions. Directly above this escalator, the primary digital security camera was mounted. Its lens was aimed precisely at the landing area in front of the doors. This camera utilized a complex mechanism of continuous panning. It swept smoothly from left to right and back again, scanning the entire spatial volume of the entrance. The speed of its mechanical rotation was meticulously calibrated by the complex's engineers. It was set so that no person walking at a normal or even accelerated pace could slip past the lens during the fraction of a second when the camera looked away. Physically, to bypass this scanning radius, an object would have to move at an unnatural, statistically anomalous speed, which would immediately be flagged by security on their monitors. At 1:15 a.m., the system captures Brian and his 2 companions ascending this escalator. The footage is striking in its digital clarity. Brian is wearing an olive green shirt over a white t-shirt and classic jeans. He steps off the escalator, crosses the landing, and walks inside. The countdown has begun. Inside, the bar features absolutely standard spatial geometry, a large main hall, a seating area, a long bar counter, and restrooms. The interior volume that night was densely packed with hundreds of patrons. At 1:55 a.m., Exactly 5 minutes before the establishment officially closes its doors, the camera's digital matrix captures Brian for the final time. He exits the main doors of the bar, stepping back onto the landing in front of the escalator. The camera dispassionately records him stopping to engage in a brief conversation with two young women. The interaction does not last long. Brian says goodbye to them. The women turn around and begin to slowly descend the escalator, leaving the complex forever. And Brian turns his back to the lens. He takes a few measured steps forward and walks back through the doors of the ugly Tuna Saloona. This is the last documented visual evidence of his presence in our reality. At exactly 2:11 a.m., the bright operational lights inside the venue are switched on. The music cuts off abruptly. This is the universal trigger for closure. The dense crowd begins to slowly and chaotically funnel toward the single public exit. Brian's friends exit with the main flow and stop at the bottom of the escalator. They wait for him. He is not there. When law enforcement gained access to the surveillance servers, the detectives did not rely on visual assumptions or intuition. They applied a rigorous, ruthless, mathematical analysis. Investigators began reviewing the tape from the camera above the escalator, starting from the exact second the bar opened its doors, ending at the moment the last employee turned off the lights and locked up. They manually, one by one, counted every single person who went up, and then they similarly counted every person who came down. The equation turned out to be almost perfect. The total volume of people who entered equaled the total volume of people who exited. From the standpoint of pure mathematics, this closed system functioned flawlessly. Zero margin of error. But among the hundreds of faces that descended that escalator that night, Brian Shaffer's face was absent. This mathematical fact inevitably generates a logical hypothesis that investigators had to test. What if he radically altered his physical appearance? What if he put on someone else's jacket, pulled down a baseball cap, and walked out, dissolving into the dense crowd, using it as camouflage? Police analysts began to combat this hypothesis, analyzing the flow of people frame by frame. They studied more than just facial features. They deeply analyzed the biomechanics of the gait, the posture, the footwear, and the shoulder width of every patron leaving the bar. And this is precisely where the physical parameters of the object become an insurmountable obstacle to this theory. Brian was nearly 6 feet, 2 inches tall. He statistically towered over the average height of the crowd. Furthermore, the camera was mounted high above the escalator, looking down at an angle. This specific perspective makes tall individuals even more dominant in the frame. It is practically impossible to hide them behind the backs of others. Additionally, to change clothes, Brian would have had to take a jacket or shirt from another patron, leaving that person visually underdressed on a cool April night. But not a single person exited the bar, lacking appropriate outerwear. The mathematical and biometric analysis of the crowd yielded a single, unappealable result. Brian did not exit through the main doors. He did not go down the escalator. The primary exit vector was officially and indisputably closed. If a physical object could not leave an isolated room through the only public exit, scientific methodology demands that we search for an alternative vector of movement. The ugly tuna did indeed have a secondary exit. It was located deep within a technical zone, strictly off-limits to customers, and used exclusively by the staff. This emergency exit led to a narrow concrete service corridor. This corridor, in turn, featured heavy metal doors that opened to a freight elevator and directly onto the rear courtyard of the complex. And the rear courtyard of the Gateway complex that spring was not just a street. It was an active, massive, heavy-duty construction site. The building was still in the expansion phase. Could Brian, whose state of intoxication was documented by witnesses and cameras, have slipped unnoticed into a restricted technical zone, navigated the service corridors, and exited through a construction site into the night city? First, the technical doors inside the bar were locked. The employees who meticulously cleaned the establishment after closing did not report a single unauthorized person in the service areas. Second, consider the topography of the construction site itself. This was not a flat, paved courtyard. It was a zone of extreme hazard. At 2 in the morning, this site plunged into absolute, impenetrable darkness. The terrain was a chaotic labyrinth of fresh, unset concrete, exposed steel rebar, massive pallets of bricks, steep elevation drops, and deep, uncovered foundation pits. Navigating this aggressive environment in total darkness, in a state of alcohol intoxication, without a light source, and doing so without falling, sustaining a serious injury, and leaving not a single microscopic trace of blood, torn fabric, or personal belongings on the sharp edges of metal, is a statistically impossible event. Third, the electronic control system. The heavy steel doors leading from the building out to this construction site were hardwired into the centralized security alarm system. The security logs from the complex servers for that night confirm an undeniable fact. The sensors on these specific emergency exits never broke the circuit. The alarm did not trigger. The doors did not open. And finally, the forensic analysis of the space itself. Police deployed highly trained K-9 units, search dogs specifically trained to track humans. The biological apparatus of these dogs can detect microscopic epithelial particles left by a human in the air and on surfaces. The handlers led the dogs through the entire bar, through every meter of the service corridors, to the freight elevator, and systematically across the entire hazardous construction site. The dogs failed to register a single trace of Brian leading toward the back exit. His olfactory trail, his biological scent, simply stopped, deep inside the premises of the bar. The spatial paradox, ultimately, closes in on itself. Brian did not leave through the main entrance, because the digital memory of the camera and strict mathematics objectively disprove it. Brian did not leave through the back exit, because the alarm electronics, the laws of physics, and the biology of the search dogs disprove it. And Brian did not remain inside the bar, because the internal volume of the establishment was repeatedly, aggressively, and methodically searched by police teams. In the following days, the investigation expanded far beyond the building. Police extracted terabytes of video data from dozens of other surveillance cameras mounted on adjacent facades, ATMs, and intersections within a multi-kilometer radius of the Gateway complex. If we assume for a moment that Brian Shaffer, by some incomprehensible miracle, defied the laws of space and materialized on the street, his physical shell would inevitably have been caught by the lens of at least one of these exterior cameras that night. But among hundreds of hours of digital recording, he was never found once. Throughout all the subsequent years, not a single financial transaction was recorded on his bank accounts. Not a single electronic ping from his mobile phone that could provide GPS coordinates. Not a single documented fact of his physical existence. The climax of this case lies not in a discovery, but in an absolute void. A human being became a glitch in a perfectly designed spatial system. We have laid out the architectural blueprints and the dry facts of the investigation before you. From the standpoint of pure logic and physics, this equation has no solution. What exactly do you think happened in the geometry of that bar on that April night? Is there an architectural blind spot that the engineers and the police failed to account for? Or is the answer forever entombed inside the building itself? Share your analytical conclusion in the comments. Let's look at this case strictly through the lens of facts, leaving all emotions aside. Thank you for joining us today. The world looks logical and perfectly constructed, right up until the moment you look at it a little too closely. If this analysis made you think, leave a like. It tells the algorithm that this case deserves to be seen. And if you want to go deeper into the next paradox, the subscribe button is right there. We'll be waiting. Stay observant, because a room might seem empty, but someone is always watching.